Were freed after the Civil War, of course. They were made citizens. They were given the right to vote. Reconstruction held the promise of lifting African Americans out of their position of inferiority. But of course, we know that didn't happen. We know there will have to be another civil rights movement 100 years later to even begin to bring African Americans into a status of equality. So what happened? Where did Reconstruction go wrong? Well, the economic collapse of the 1870s and the scandals of the Grant administration will basically take everybody's mind off of Reconstruction. Northerners quit thinking much about the African American question. By the 1876 election, only South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida are still under Northern rule. They still have Northern troops in them. The other states have basically gone back to running themselves. In the Upper South, the whites are the majority and they gain control through elections. In the Deep South, they simply use violence to suppress the black vote. The Knights of White Camellia and the Ku Klux Klan will be terrorist groups that arise to keep black people from exerting their political power. Today we talk more about the Ku Klux Klan, but at the time the Knights of White Camellia were probably a more important, more significant, a larger group. But they were the same thing. They were terrorist groups who went around and would burn crosses in yards and murder people, murder blacks and things like this. Red shirts and white leagues police elections to disenfranchise blacks and make sure that whites voted for Democrats. Remember, there's no secret ballot yet. So everybody would stand there and listen to how you vote, and the parties would write down how everybody voted. And so and they would intimidate blacks to prevent them from going to the polls. The strongest pressure was that most whites would not do business with anybody who voted Republican. So even if you agreed with the Republicans, if you, say, owned a store or you were a farmer and you were trying to sell your goods, if you voted Republican, the majority of whites would treat you like you didn't exist and you couldn't make a living. So there was a lot of pressure not to be a Republican in the South. The enforcement of the Ku Klux Klan Acts of 1871 and 1872 were aimed at preventing voter discrimination. They made it a federal crime to intimidate voters. This was to avoid Southern courts. If it was just a state or a local crime, it would go to a local court with a local white jury who would obviously rule in favor of the people being intimidating the black voter. But if it went to a federal court, a federal judge could actually get something done. It also authorized the use of federal troops against terrorist groups and will actually use the U.S. Army to shut down the Knights of White Camellia and the Ku Klux Klan in South Carolina in 1872. And this really marks the end of the period of significant Klan activity. It was a very short time period here. We're really looking at the late 1860s into the early 1870s, and then the Klan is going to fade away more or less until we get to the 20th century, and we'll revisit that then. Many radical Republicans demanded passage of the 15th Amendment, then declared victory when it was passed, and they were done with it. They moved on. They had fixed the problem of African Americans. Sumner and Greeley, two of the main radical Republicans, will declare that they are now liberal Republicans and begin reaching across the aisle to work with the Democrats. They denounce carpetbaggers and corruption in the Republican South, so they're actually now attacking the whites who've gone down to the South for being corrupt. The Panic of 1873 cost Republicans the Congress. In 1874, we have a Congress dominated by Democrats, and they're certainly not going to do anything to help the blacks in the South. U.S. Grant begins withdrawing troops from the South after this election, and we begin to see the fading away of the attempts at Reconstruction. Grant attempts to run for a third term. He attempts to be the first president to get elected to 3 terms. But he is so tarnished by the scandals that he's gone through that the Republicans don't even nominate him. He's the sitting president. He can't even get the nomination. Rutherford B. Hayes is, of course, a Civil War veteran and the governor of Ohio. And he is talking about a new issue, civil service reform. The Grant administration had been so blatant about putting party members into positions of power. There's now talk about making people take some sort of test and being hired like a normal employee, not as a political appointee, to work for the federal government. The Democrats will get behind New York Governor Samuel Tilden, who has become famous by battling corruption in New York City. He had brought the Tweed Ring, the famous corrupt city government of New York City, to its knees. It was a bitter campaign, but there was really little policy difference. Both of them were campaigning against corruption, essentially, and nobody was really talking about slavery or civil rights for blacks anymore. Tilden carries the entire South, plus New York, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. And he wins. But you've never heard of a President Samuel Tilden, and here's why. The Republicans will claim victory in Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida, and Oregon, even though the original vote showed Tilden had won. There was no system for handling this in the Constitution. There was no precedent. Nobody knew what to do. Basically, even though it looked for all the world like Tilden was president, the Republicans were just simply refusing to accept that. Well, in order for Hayes to win, for the Republican to win, he would need to win all 4 of these states. If any one of these states went to Tilden, Tilden was president. But the problem was the Senate was controlled by Republicans and the House was controlled by Democrats, so they can't agree. Nobody knows what to do. So they create a 15-man commission. There are 5 from the Senate, 5 from the House, and 5 from the Supreme Court. 7 will be Democrats, 7 will be Republican, and 1 will be the independent Supreme Court Justice, David Davis. Then, this is the Republican trick, the governor of Illinois then appoints Davis to an open Senate seat. Now, 1 more Supreme Court Justice has to join the commission to decide who won the election, and all the remaining Supreme Court justices are Republicans, so we end up with 8 Republicans on the committee, 7 Democrats. The Republicans had planned this out all along, and the 8 Republicans say Hayes won, even though it was clear that he did not. The 7 Democrats say that Tilden won, and the Democrats threatened to filibuster the bill making Hayes the president, and now we have a crisis. There's a backroom deal. Leaders of both parties get together in the literal smoke-filled room, and they agree on this. Hayes will appoint 1 Southerner to the cabinet. He will not run for re-election in 1880. He will give Democrats control over all federal jobs in the southern states. The federal government will build a railroad from New Orleans through Texas to the Pacific, and all troops will be withdrawn from the South. Now understand that. This is the end of Reconstruction. This is the end of any Northern attempts to help Southern blacks for 100 years. And why did they do it? To gain the presidency for 1 year. I would argue that the whole Reconstruction period is about one thing: Republican votes. They wanted the blacks to be free because they wanted them to vote because they knew they'd vote Republican. And when they have a chance to decide between helping the African Americans in the South or getting a Republican into office, they get the Republican into office. Hayes will spend his 4 years in office openly being called his fraudulency because everybody knows that he didn't win the election. And the New South will become enraged and bitter, even more so than they already were, over this election of 1876. This is called the Compromise of 1877, by the way. So, the legacy of Reconstruction. Reconstruction failed. It did improve life for blacks. They were free. Their income levels go up somewhat. Their land ownership goes up somewhat. Don't get me wrong. They were able to create their own societies and institutions separate from whites, and I'm sure that was a great relief for them. And it wasn't that bad for whites either. The ruling white class is back in power completely by 1880, totally suppressing any political power of blacks. And all attempts at any sort of equality are totally abandoned, and the whites have a better economic system. Sharecropping is better for whites than slavery ever was. And blacks are left to the mercy of Southern whites. They're left to the violence and the oppression that Southern whites want to heap on them. The 14th and 15th Amendments, by the way, the one making black citizens and guaranteeing blacks the right to vote, will be almost completely ignored until the 1950s. A series of Supreme Court rulings will strip them of any sort of meaningful power. And even though they're passed in the 1870s, they will have no real significant impact until the 1950s.